Hi again then guys, and welcome to, of course, another installment of Beards and Cars, my podcast style layout where we talk about a variety of topics, discussions, countdowns, predictions even. And this particular installment is more on the vein of just that, predictions. And of course we've done a number of prediction videos recently. I've predicted cars, I've predicted tracks, and we'll have to wait and see, of course, if those turn out to be correct or not. But this one is less specific. It's not like 10 cars or 5 tracks. It's more of an overarching idea of speculation, and in a similar way to how we've discussed in the past the kind of classes of racing that should come to the game, some of those actually have. I know for a fact that I mentioned Group C Le Mans in that video because it was the thumbnail, and we then had it a few months later with the exact car that I featured in the thumbnail, the Sauber C9. I believe in that video I also mentioned Super GT, which of course we have now as well, 6 of them in fact. It's been one of the strongest categories of car to feature in updates. In fact, if you actually look at how many in that category there are compared to others that we've had added, like supercars or classics in general. So those things do happen. They're not predictions, they're just things that are more like a wish list, but ones which are an understandable wish list. Some others, which a lot of people are still asking for, haven't happened yet. I would say there's probably 3 in particular: Pikes Peak, NASCAR, and DTM. Those 3 seem hugely popular, and then I would say just behind that it seems to be V8 supercars, perhaps. Maybe behind that WRC. But the top 3 are undoubtedly, from what I've seen in comments and messages, those 3 in particular. Now this video is about 2 separate categories which are integrally linked, and they often overlap in people's minds, and that is classics and vintage cars. Now technically there are actually 3 classes. There are classic cars, there are vintage cars, and then there are, I can never remember the name, there's something before, antiques. That's the one. There are antique cars, even before vintage. Now I can't recall the exact years that those things officially or unofficially change, but for me I don't even use antiques as a term. I just use classic and vintage. And for me, I categorise everything post-1950 as a classic, and everything before 1950 as vintage. Now, of course, you've got multiple categories in there: pre-war, post-war, antique, dawn of the car, etc. Now, I would say, and some people won't like to hear this because some people just hate the mention of Forza at all, but I would say that speaking purely based on fact and numbers, not to do with favoritism, preference, anything, just facts, Forza is undoubtedly leading the market when it comes to vintage cars. In fact, Forza may well have the strongest selection of vintage cars of any racing series ever. If you just consider how many there are in the motorsport games and in the Horizon games. They've got the Bentley 8 litre, which was finally drivable, the Bentley Blower, the classic Silver Arrow Grand Prix cars in Motorsport 7 and Horizon, a variety of others too which are full-on vintage cars, ultimate collector's pieces, way older than something like a Ferrari 250 GTO or a Miura, but just as collectible, if not more so. And often they are race cars, Bugatti Type 35C, various others like that too. So in terms of sheer volume, nothing else comes close to how many they've got, and I love them all. They're very expensive, but you can totally understand why. Now the funny thing is, although I would say that Forza is definitely leading the market, Gran Turismo has still had some vintage cars which Forza has never had. Now some of them might come to Forza eventually because they're the kind of car that you could imagine doing that with, but at least for now, Gran Turismo has about 5 or so. In fact, no, they have 7 that I can think of, 7 unique vintage cars that Forza has never had. And they were the Benz Motorwagen, the Daimler Motor Carriage, the Ford Model T, the Auto Union Streamliner, the original Beetle, and what was the last one that I was thinking of? I think there might have been, oh yeah, there were 2, the Volkswagen Kubelwagen and the Schwimmwagen. Forza hasn't had any of those cars that I just mentioned. And all of those I think are pretty cool for one reason or another. The Auto Union is of course by far the fastest, and that's the closest to Forza because they had the classic Silver Arrows, which are basically like the open wheel version of that same era. But of course the Auto Union is a completely different animal, pure straight line monster. But Gran Turismo has had some vintage cars. Far more classics. I mean, tons of classics. If you put the selection year, for instance, in GT6 to between 1950 and let's say 1989, which is basically classics, anything between that period, there are tons, hundreds upon hundreds of classics. Now, of course, in GT Sport, there are more classics in GT6 than there are cars in GT Sport. But we did see the very cool development of classics being brought back. The first one, of course, being the Shelby Cobra. Then I believe the next one might have been the C3 Corvette after that. And even in the last update, the December one, we saw two return, the C2 Corvette and the Pontiac Trans Am, bringing Pontiac as an entire brand back to the game. So as far as the two-part question goes, I think that one half of it is, funnily enough, a dead cert, and the other half I think has almost no chance whatsoever, which is funny given how close people think of classic and vintage as being. Now, classics, are more classics coming to the game? Undoubtedly, of course they are. We've got more packs coming. It's simple fact, statistical fact based on the previous ones, we're going to get more classics. It's more a question of what, not if. Now I personally think, and I've mentioned a number of times, that there are certain classics which have a very strong chance. I would say the number one classic that I would put my money on is a Mercedes 300 SL Gullwing. Then the next one would probably be a 69 Camaro, and then a Lancia Stratos. I think those are probably my top three in terms of very, very highly likely. Then maybe just behind that, the BMW 507. But those are all classic cars, which we've had a number of. And that's great. There are some outstanding classics. In fact, the GT40 is a classic, and that's probably the single best car in the game for earning money. It doesn't own the most. An N200 car, of course, can earn more in that specific race, but the Ford can do it quicker. It's so easy. It's just got the whole package. So classics can be very useful. And the funny thing about bringing up cars like classic and vintage ones, and doubtless there will be comments like this down below, people who haven't even watched this far in the video, people who probably didn't watch any of the video, they just click on it and type what they want. You see these comments saying, oh, well, actually, GT Sport isn't that kind of game. It doesn't feature classic cars or vintage cars, it's about modern FIA competition. Well, no, it's not, because the Samba Bus is in the game, the Fiat 500 is in the game, a number of other utterly useless cars, let's be honest. Compared to anything else in the racing sphere, they are just classic collector's pieces and nothing more. Even the oldest car in the game currently is from 1952, and that's the Abarth by Posto Bertoni, which isn't all that useful for racing, but they still keep adding them. So that logic simply doesn't work. Factually, it's just wrong. There are tons of cars which are not necessary in the slightest to FIA racing, but they're still adding them, giving it more of a traditional Gran Turismo vibe. Now, how many of those are coming as a result of the community asking for more classics, and how many they'd already had planned is up for debate. Based on how long it takes to render the cars, put them into the game, I would be inclined to think that they probably were already planning to bring some back. It's possible that some were extra. I think something like the Cobra, for instance, was planned from the start, because it came so early. Whereas others, you could make more of an argument on the other end. I don't particularly care. Either way, it's just a possibility. As far as vintage, though, well, we have none. There are no cars from before 1952, and I think that if we see any vintage cars, I believe that the strongest likelihood is probably vintage Grand Prix, because of that connection to motorsport, its lineage. I highly doubt that we'll get something like a vintage rally car, because it's just such a niched thing. You know, like a classic Rolls-Royce Dakar style machine. But vintage Grand Prix, that's possible, I think. I would still say there's like a 2% chance of it actually happening, but I would say that if it does happen, that's probably the best chance. Or something like the Bugatti Type 35 era, or the real old school Alfa Romeo P3, those kind of things. And I think that if one of those were to come to the game, of course it would be in Group X, we already know that, but I think it would probably be more so as a result of being a GT award winner than anything else. Something like a Pebble Beach or SEMA Motor Show. I mean, of the two, it's more likely to be Pebble Beach given that it's vintage cars, but I think that it will be an award winner that comes to the game, not something else. For instance, already we've seen, I believe, 2 classic cars, classic motorsport cars, in fact, win the GT award. I believe an Aston Martin DBR1 and the Eagle Westlake Grand Prix car, I believe it was. Both of those, great classics. Both of those we've never seen before. They could easily, justifiably be 20 million credit cars, especially the Aston. It would be in good company there. So we're seeing more classics. I mean, we don't know when we're going to get them, but vintage, we've still seen none of that. So it's funny how close people think of classic and vintage as being. Often the line is just blended for many people, and yeah, I would say that the one side has 100% chance and the other side has almost 100% chance in the opposite way. I would say there's definitely a 100% chance of getting more classic cars. It's a dead cert, as I said. And I think there's like a 98% chance that we'll never see any vintage cars in GT Sport at all. And I think that if we do, it'll probably be 1 or 2 which are as a result of the GT award, which probably won't really surprise anyone once you think about it, because that kind of makes sense. That's the sort of thing that would usually happen for a vintage car to come to the game. Now, I don't believe stuff like the Model T was as a result of that, but I do miss vehicles like that. Now, of course, they're even less useful than something like a Samba bus, but that's kind of not the point, because in the older Gran Turismo games they would feature these classic and vintage cars not because they were good in a racing sense, but because they were so significant to the birth of the car and to the history of the car. And I would say that the very clear inclination, even as soon as you turn on the game, because it's the home menu, the very clear, strong inclination that GT Sport has toward valuing history. I mean, the entire main menu is a history lesson about, what kind of earrings Margaret Thatcher wore and stuff like that. It's clearly an important thing still to Polyphony to talk about history, not just of cars, but now in general as well. And there are, in fact, a number of vintage cars featured in scapes. The Mercedes Museum is a perfect example, where you can actually see, I believe, the patent motor wagon. I'm not sure if the Daimler motor carriage is in the image, I think it is. But yeah, they're in the game, technically, but they're not in the game. So overall, I would say, as I said, that there's a definite chance of more classics. It's not even a chance, it's just definite. Vintage, as much as it saddens me to say it because I love them, I don't think there's much of a chance. As far as vintage cars that I would like to see, briefly, I think by far my favourite category of vintage cars is the 1930s and technically 20s, but primarily the 30s luxury scene. Stuff like the Bentley 8 litre, like the old school Cadillac V16s of that kind of time period, the big old Duesenbergs, the Chrysler Imperial. These massive, massive cars that don't handle particularly well and they're not all that quick, but they just look fantastic. They're big, imposing, heavy cars, and if you were to be selective about the vintage cars that you brought back, you could still bring back some actually very useful ones for certain types of racing. Something like, for instance, the Doble E20, which is one of my favourite vintage cars, the steam car from, I believe, the 20s. If I recall correctly, it might have been 1925. A car with about 150 horsepower, 1,000 pound-feet of torque, steam engine, direct drive, and it could do about 135 miles per hour, I think it was, way back in the 20s. It was one of the quickest cars around, essentially a supercar of that era. Imagine what that could do in N100. It could be a really cool car. Not necessarily as quick as something like the Honda S660, but certainly more useful than many, say, younger players might think a vintage car could be. And I think that that's one of the issues with vintage cars featuring in games. It seems like developers don't focus as much on them because they think that people won't be as bothered by them. But if you look at Forza as the example again, they've proven that younger people even are interested in those cars. They love driving the Bentley 8 litre. The Bentley Blower is the ultimate barn find in Horizon 4, and loads of people wanted to have it. There is a clear love for vintage cars, and that's something that I love to see because they deserve more attention. It's not a time period that should be left behind, it's a very cool one. Classics tend to get all the love, but vintage is a very cool category with a ton of undervalued cars, both in road and racing form. So overall, those are my thoughts on the future of classic and vintage cars in GT Sport specifically. And of course, if you want to check out a variety of other topics, I mean, we've done tons of episodes, around 80 in fact in this series, so of course you can go back, click through here on screen and check those out. And apart from that, I'll see you next week. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.